What is up? Back again. I've gotten lots of questions about books that I really like and books that I'd recommend to people if, I was to give them a recommendation. And instead of going through and responding to everyone and giving, these detailed lists of books, I decided I'd just do a video outlining my top 10 favorite books as of 2020. These books are going to be restricted to theory and philosophy, so nonfiction. Don't get at me about theory fiction or any of that, because I'm not going to enter that debate. But before jumping into it, if you want to support me, you can do that via Patreon or PayPal, or non-monetarily by simply liking, sharing, subscribing, telling your friends. I've heard I have a soothing voice. I might be able to help your friends sleep at night if they want, some boring white dude telling them about the mysteries of the universe. I'm going to make this also available in podcast form. So for YouTube watchers, obviously you're going to have a more full-fledged experience because you're going to have the visuals of the books. But I'll describe them in enough detail that you can actually get something out of this in podcast form where there won't be any ads. And hopefully I'm going to keep it that way because ads are annoying. And I have funny stories about people trying to advertise on my podcast that maybe one day I'll share, but I don't want to get into that now. Without wasting any more time, let me get into my 10 favorite books as of now. Now, they aren't in any order until the last two, and the last two are the most meaningful to me, or that had the most impact on me, so stay tuned for those. But I want to start with one that I don't actually have on hand, at least I don't have a physical copy of, and that is Sara Ahmed's The Cultural Politics of Emotion. And the reason I really like this book, and there's another one that I kind of align with it in that it does the same thing, is Sunera Tobani's Exalted Subjects. And the reason I like both of these books, but I am giving Ahmed's book the kind of real call out here, is that they discuss the ways that nations are formed and how certain people within nations develop a certain right or level of exaltation to be the rightful bearers of that nation and what that nation necessarily means, which is an interesting argument in its own right. But Ahmed has a particular talent of leaving no stone unturned. And I just found myself, whenever I was reading some argument she was developing, I'd start thinking about something and be like, well, what about this? And lo and behold, she'd almost always bring it up, which I thought was obviously really, really good, at least for me. And I guess I should have prefaced all this by saying that this is, of course, just my opinion. This is by no means exhaustive of the greatest philosophical or theoretical text of all time, but just putting it out there. So that's number one, The Cultural Politics of Emotion. Number two, I have Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, which, for the most part, we probably all know about. This book is interesting for a number of reasons, because it's not that well written, and, Judith Butler herself has come out and said that she doesn't really like how she approached the subject matter through her writing. It is infamously difficult to read at times, and she has these very long paragraphs essentially just comprised of questions, which I hate. But the arguments she levels in it blew my mind. At the time when I was first confronted with these ideas, obviously they changed my world, and for that I have to give her a shout out here, because it's just awesome. And of course, many of her other books could be replaced here, Bodies That Matter, Not Undoing Gender. That one didn't stand out to me too much. So that's Butler, obviously a seminal figure in feminist studies, and the bridging of feminism with more with the kind of established camp of post-structuralism, which is obviously in my wheelhouse. For anyone that's watched my stuff here, it's definitely something I'm into. All right, next, Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. Now, this book I was kind of wrestling whether or not to include this one, because it's been a long time since I read it. But at the time, it blew my world apart with regards to understanding the origins of fascism, specifically in Nazi Germany. But one of the things that really stood out to me is Arendt's kind of historical analysis, which is something that I certainly strive for as an academic, in that she was able to make sense of historical instances and facts that relate to an overall narrative without decontextualizing, at least to my best knowledge. And one of the things that she does really well in this book is tracing the fermenting anti-Semitism that led up to Nazi Germany. Because I think that we're all too willing to say, wow, those anti-Semitic Germans, when in fact all of these other countries around them, all across the world, anti-Semitism was entrenched within their very kind of political and social ethos. She gives all of these kind of historical explanations as to how it could arise. Finally, in the conclusion, in the final paragraphs, in the final chapters, she really develops her idea about loneliness being a precursor to totalitarianism, which is obviously extremely relevant. And this is for anyone out there wanting to write an essay, what can be said about today's predicament? Does the internet foster loneliness, or does it not? That might lead to fascism in this way. Has it contributed to the emerging pretty well fascist regimes all across the world? Leaving that out there. I'm sure it's already been written, but I just don't know. All right, next. And I'll just say, Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus. Now, obviously, this is a seminal book, one that really I felt more compelled to put in than I necessarily wanted to, because a lot of it I'm just kind of neutral about. It doesn't do much for me. But the chapters that deal with the earliest state formation, so those are the chapters on the war machine and apparatus of capture, including maybe one of the chapters dealing with the body without organs, were just completely expanded my horizons. And so it's for that reason I couldn't ignore it. And I would like to just say additionally, I have an undying interest in archaeology and kind of early anthropology dealing with the emergence of states, and some of my own work might kind of intersects with that, and so I obviously am motivated by that. But Deleuze and Guattari are really good at bringing out the wackiness of human society that I think a lot of people try to shy away from, or that they try to whitewash in favor of positivist historical developments that obviously just make clear sense. Deleuze and Guattari are all over the place, and that's one of the things I certainly like about them, in that they're really playing out what they're describing. This kind of deterritorialization, developing these lines of flight, these rhizomatic movements that allow for kind of newness or possibility. Now, the next book is probably the most complicated one, and one that whenever I return to, I'm always like, I got that totally wrong the first time. But that's Homi Bhabha's The Location of Culture. If you've ever tried to read this book, you'd know exactly what I mean. It is so unbelievably complicated. It belongs to the realm of kind of post-colonial studies, critical race theory, but it is just most of the time beyond my comprehension. I would also just like to say that Bhabha is not the most generous writer, in that he doesn't make it quite as accessible to his readers as I think he could have. But with that being said, the arguments that he levels are really interesting to me, because they just totally reshaped the terrain of post-colonial studies that was, for a while, looking at the work of Edward Said, really focused on a kind of top-down understanding of colonial relations, which is obviously a big part of colonization. But Baba kind of turns it around and says, well, it's not as though identity is just is kind of bestowed upon colonized subjects by a colonizer. Like, that seems too reductive. In fact, there's a kind of what he calls a kind of hybridity occurring. Now, he doesn't say that to try to diminish the effects of colonization. Absolutely not, nor the power of colonizers upon colonized bodies. But he is saying it to at least nuance the discussion to give us a better understanding of the situation at hand and its three-dimensional characteristics. Three-dimensional character. And next should be no surprise to anyone that's listened to any of my stuff. And I was really unsure which text of his to put, but I decided to go with Fatal Strategies by Jean Baudrillard, who is someone whose work I've dealt with quite a bit. And I've covered pretty much every one of his books on this channel or this podcast. But this text for me, it's really hard for me to choose which one because I had to narrow it down because he has like 35 or 40 books. But this text is the one in which I feel he just sprouts as a kind of quote-unquote radical thinker, moving beyond the traditional camps of what I'll just call theory into a new kind of what you would call radical theory. And it's because of that, at least it's because of this book being that kind of first push in that direction, that I really cling on to it. And in this book, he discusses a wide range of topics from, terrorism to chance, which might seem strange, to obviously, simulation, to the media, to all these different topics, and really gives, in my mind, one of the first real expositions into power. I know that's kind of a slippery term to use in when considering Baudrillard. When considering power in relation to mass media, in relation to terrorism, in relation to simulated communications and whatnot, that still hasn't been fully unpacked. And this book is riddled with mysteries. It is by no means easy to jump into, and if you're looking for a book to start out with Baudrillard, it might not be the best place to start, because I still wrestle with some of the ideas, but it's very rewarding if you can actually sit down and really grapple with the ideas that he develops. Now, probably my favorite writer, well, that's not true, but I can't not give him the amount of credit he deserves, but that's Michel Foucault and Madness and Civilization. So Madness and Civilization was, I guess, his first book, or I guess this was his dissertation. And the thing about Foucault that I like, that I find is forgotten or not really considered as much, are the little insights that he sprinkles into his analysis when he's discussing the treatment of quote-unquote mad or the mentally ill, where he describes that they're treated like subhuman animals, or he discusses them in terms of what he calls a kind of, or this might be in relation to prisoners, but in any case the same can be said. He refers to them as being held in a kind of inverse exaltation. So they are praised, exalted, but in a negative way, because of their relationship not to doing something good, not their having done something good, but they are exalted because of having done something bad, and therefore being closer to death, and therefore being closer to God. So they are the sign of God's existence, further having done something wrong. So it was it was prisoners. But it's those little moments that I find Foucault the most interesting, and they happen throughout. And I feel like a lot of the time those little nuances get lost in favor of, discussions about power, governmentality, these kind of big overarching ideas. Whereas for me, and Madness and Civilization really encapsulates that well, is his discussions of the minute instances in these regimes of power and how they play out and how they are kind of usurped from within in these little moments of transgression. Next, this is number 8 to keep you on track. And this one is a little bit, it might seem like it doesn't really belong because it's not really a kind of single authored book per se. I guess neither is 1,000 Plateaus, but anyways, this is more of a overview of a field, but I have to give it credit because it did wonders for me. And that's Annie Alumba's Colonialism / Postcolonialism. And it is just a wonderful introduction to the field of postcolonialism that, even though I say is an introduction, does not shy away from the more complicated ideas, bridging Homi Bhabha's work with, Jacques Derrida and a whole slew of other thinkers to make sense, of course, like Spivak, to make sense of colonialism and its effects. And the reason I included it is just because it is such a wonderful introduction to that field. Now, the last two, and these ones are without a doubt my favorite, the best of the best in my mind as of 2020. And they are, well, I'll present them one at a time. Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. If you haven't read it, I don't know what you're doing. It was the thing that I was like, why would I read that? It's a book I heard about. I'm more interested in, feminist thought, critical race stuff, post-structuralism. Why am I going to go back and read Kant? Thank God I did, because it blew my mind. Kant develops, I don't even know how to say it, but if you want a kind of philosophical justification for there existing a world of appearances versus a world of what he calls, things in themselves, obviously Kant is the place to go. Now, what is so fascinating is that he applies it in a way as to demonstrate the limitations of, you guessed it, pure reason, in a way that's, to me, unrivaled. And so you have to read it. And I'll just say it. Kant is greater than Hegel. I like Kant significantly more. Come at me. But yeah, great book. I definitely recommend it. It is extremely difficult though. You're going to have to be reading it with some kind of aid or summary alongside in order to make sense of some of the interesting language. He's developing all these, I guess he was developing these neologisms in German to try to really develop his argument, but holy God, it is worth it. And finally, probably the most significant book that I've ever read, and that is, and you've probably never heard of, is Roberto Colasso's The Ruin of Kash. And this, it's impossible to give a summary of this book. Every chapter deals with something fundamentally different. But the overarching theme is that our history as humans in what I will just reductively call modern civilization is underwritten by a number of superstitious beliefs, a number of kind of enchanting ideas that keep us tethered to mysticism, to the unknown. And this plays out in the form of sacrifice. And sacrifice plays a fundamental role in his work, and for him, throughout the course of human history. And he's taken this from the work of René Girard, who deals with that topic a lot. But I really can't stress how eclectic Colasso is, and he has books on a whole range of topics, from Greek mythology to Indian mythology, dealing with the Vedic tradition and the Veda, if I pronounce that right, to a book on Kafka, essays on Nietzsche. He's a library in himself. And this book, deals with the French Revolution to Marx, to a woodsman and a fisherman and the random people in the forest, to Max Stirner, to Nietzsche, to scientific lab developments. It's so eclectic, and for that reason, it blew my mind on a number of different fronts. And he's just a wonderful, wonderful writer, Italian-born writer, fluent in English, Italian, German, I think. And his wife too is extremely famous in Italy. Fleur, I don't know how to pronounce it right. Jaeggy, who's she's a literary person. She writes fiction books, but she's another big figure in Italy. But yeah, Colasso's The Ruin of Kash. If you were to read any one of these books, that would be the one I'd really insist upon. But it is incredibly difficult. You really need to have Wikipedia open to approach it, because it's just really it's so eclectic that you're going to need some kind of aid to help you understand what he's talking about, because he's just that, he just draws upon that much material. And that's more or less it, my kind of the books that stand out to me the most. I might do a fiction one at some point, but I don't know. But if, whatever. If you like what I did here, like, share, subscribe. Give me your recommendations for books. I'd love to hear it. And then click on one of these sides for video recommendations, whichever one happens to be where they go. And yeah, I'll catch you next time.